Well, welcome everyone to Conscious Cafe Global. My name's Gina Lazenby and I'm your host this evening. Very, very special event. We're going to be talking about synchronicity, interconnection and purpose. And I have with us from America, Dr. Jeff Dunn. And he is the president of the International Consciousness Research Laboratories Organization. And that was set up in 1996 to continue the research the effects of consciousness on physical systems carried out at Princeton University, the PEAR lab. And that is the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. Now, some of you may have heard of that. That is something that was started in 1979 and ran until 2007. And what they were researching was the influence of our conscious intention on other things. This is exactly what Jeff's going to be talking about. And I was lucky enough, I met Jeff 3+ years ago now at the Science and Consciousness Summit, which takes place at Broughton Sanctuary, which is literally 5 minutes from this building from my home. And we have our 4th one. It's kind of parked now at Broughton, which is really exciting, an annual event there. And that is a gathering of healers, psychics, spiritual, lay people and scientists. It's a fantastic melting pot of ideas, and all those of us who are interested in the other, the senses and the exploration of science with that. That's what Jeff's talking about tonight. And what was really exciting at that first event where I met Jeff was all the equipment from that PEAR lab, from the research lab, was brought over, and it's now installed at Broughton in what's called the Weird Room. And weird, not W-E-I-R-D, but the magical word W-Y-R-D. And we all have the sense, don't we, Jeff, that we're normal. The weird is normal, and anybody who doesn't believe in the weird is actually weird. So, in addition to all this research that Jeff leads in consciousness, he has a background of decades of research with Johns Hopkins University in acoustics, data science, and artificial intelligence. He's also an award-winning playwright and has written his book Nexus, which I've got here and really enjoyed. And I'm sure he's going to tell us about it. He's talking about the concept of syntropy. I really enjoyed it, Jeff. So this is Jeff's book. So Jeff, here you are, and we welcome you. If we were in a room, we would all be applauding. We're all going to wave and welcome.
Excellent. Well, thank you. If you see my whole room shifting back and forth, I have to tell you that is my additional guest here. She is orange and furry and currently trying to destroy my desk. So if I seem to be moving around at random positions, it's to try to keep my cat from completely knocking the monitor over. She's quite the state today. So thank you all for coming today. I'm very excited about this. This is indeed an opportunity to talk about a variety of subjects that are certainly amongst my favorites. And I want to start off by offering a premise. And this particular premise is not going to be phrased in terms of interconnectedness, like the title of the speech, but I'm going to get to drawing the connection and showing that, in fact, they're fundamentally related to each other. And that premise is that our consciousness, establishes time and space as convenient categories for storytelling. And what I mean by that when I say storytelling is being able to look, I shouldn't say look, I got to be careful, to have experience, to have sensation and perception, and then to be able to talk about that, to talk about it with others, to share the experiences that we have, but also to talk about it to ourselves, that in fact, the value of time and space is really to help us organize our sensations in a way that we can relate to them, that we can put them in some kind of narrative that allows us to look at ourselves and our lives for a particular reason. And we're gonna get into a lot of the details of that. But it really was in exploring the nature of interconnectedness through the various results that we saw in Princeton, through that research, through the idea of synchronicity, which is a term that I think more people are familiar with in the research of PEAR, but even other aspects of physics, the laws of physics as we understand them, both those pieces that are relatively well known and pieces that are not. And so hopefully we'll tie all that together. But one, and there she is trying to jump up again. But one thing that will invariably come out of all of this, talking about the nature of reality, and if we indeed are what create time and space, if this is all an important aspect of understanding interconnectedness, there is a natural question that arises out of any of these kinds of conversation, and that is, why would we do this life as we experience it as human beings? Why would we do this at all, right? And in that context, we have to step back for a moment and think about what is the nature of value to us as living beings, as conscious beings. What makes something valuable, worthwhile? And so before diving into the topics themselves, I want to just take a moment and have everybody contemplate that question. And I'll be very specific about this, and then I'll ask the question, and then Gina will hopefully break us all into small groups and give us maybe what we think, 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something like that to have the conversation. I'll leave the specifics to Gina. But here's the core question, right? If you had the ability to do anything that you wanted, right, without limitation, without consequence, if you could know everything that there is to know, would you? And why? Why would you? Either why would you or why wouldn't you? Right? And underneath this is the real question: what is the nature of value? But again, in small groups, give a little bit of thought and a little bit of discussion. If you were given the option of being able to do anything that you wanted, you're omnipotent, and you knew everything, you were omniscient, would you do it? So hold on to those thoughts, sort of put them in the back of your mind, and let them sort of sing while the rest of the discussion goes on, and we'll ultimately come back to that question: what is value? But as I started off, I said, my proposition really from the very beginning, if you read the description of the talk, is that we're part of an interconnected whole. We're not individual beings. And furthermore, what I've sort of added in the beginning of today was this idea that time and space are not fundamental properties of an objective universe, but rather something that we bring about. The idea of me is just one tiny little aspect of everything. And yet we agree in some sense to live within time and space within a lifetime that makes sense. And I ask the question, why? Why would we do this? There are a lot of reasons that or pardon me, a lot of evidence that suggests that this way of thinking about things is actually much more aligned with our experience base. And I want to sort of break this out into three different areas. One, in terms of models, ideas of how things are structured. Think of the laws of physics as one good example of models, right? And I want to talk about that. And I want to talk a bit about experiments that have been done to test these models. But ultimately, I think the most important evidence for any of this is our experience. And when I talk about synchronicity, it's really our experiences of synchronicity that I think are the most compelling out of any of this. But I want to go through each of these individually and give a little bit of background. First, if you think about ourselves as a me, and this idea that maybe we really are not as isolated as we seem to think, right? I've got the idea of Jeff. Jeff is this person right here. Then there's Gina. She's in the top corner of my screen. I can see her. She's a different person. And philosophers and mystics throughout thousands of years have been telling us that this is kind of a little bit of an illusion, that we are much more part of the same system than we are as completely separate beings. Of course, modern science tends to tell us that that's not the case. We are the individual, but even if you follow modern science's approach, think about this, right? Well, it's not internally consistent. For example, this is Jeff. Jeff is this person, except what really is this person, right? I comprise, for every one molecule that is uniquely human, human biological stuff, there are another 10 that are microbes, microorganisms, bacteria, fungus, all these sorts of things. So if you break down who we are, we're not a single individual ourselves, right? We are biological collectives. Right? And the idea that we may be part of a larger biological collective, we may be to the earth as our own individual cells are to us, is actually surprisingly straightforward as an idea, right? As above, so below. This is a mirror to everything. The way that if you drill down inside of a particular person, you get into my stomach, I've got bacteria that are busy doing all kinds of interesting things. That bacteria itself is not a single unified entity. It's made up of all kinds of different components of cells, ultimately through atoms and through subatomic particles and all the rest of this. There really is no particular thing that exists independent of everything else. It just says, this is it. This is the fundamental thing. And the more we drill down into it, the more we realize that it keeps going seemingly forever. In the same way that if you looked at a fractal pattern at the large picture, it looks like a picture, and then you drill down and you find that no matter how far you drill down into that, it has every bit as much complexity as it does at the highest level. Give me a moment to tell it that I'm speaking in English and not Arabic. Okay, I've never seen that pop up. Cool. So the very idea that we are unique atomic individuals as human beings is kind of silly, right? We seem to be in a relationship with everything else, and the model follows through the same way that we would expect all of the cells to be different in our own body. Well, of course, we are each unique and different in the world. We have humans out there, we've got other animals, plants, all these different elements that all work together to create an overall ecosystem. So there's a lot of consistency in just thinking about it in the purely traditional way of thinking about science. There is another aspect from the scientific perspective that I want to share, however, and that is the principle of syntropy. Gina had mentioned at the very beginning the book that I had written is called Nexus. And the reason that I wrote that book was I became very inspired by the idea of syntropy about maybe 10, 15 years ago. There was another book. Oh, I actually have the book. I just saw it on my screen. This was good planning, or not really planning, but it was a book that I read, Syntropy, The Spirit of Love, and it really spoke to me. I was very surprised. It talked a lot about principles and experiences that I had had in my life and didn't have a good way of explaining. And I got very excited about it one day. I was talking to the author of that book, and I said, you know, I love this book, and I think it would be great to write a much more accessible version of it, maybe not even scientific, just as a novel. And Udisi, who is one of the authors of the book, said, that's a great idea, but I don't write that kind of thing, so why don't you write it? And then that sort of became the challenge. And Nexus is what came out of that challenge. So it's written as a novel. It's a story. You don't have to read it for the science, but the intent of it is to share the ideas of that. And so I want to share those ideas briefly with you. The principle of syntropy is related to the principle of entropy. And entropy is considerably better known. The basic idea is that if you look at the equations of physics, they're solutions, equal parts that have energy and information that propagates either forward or backward in time. As far as the laws of physics are concerned, it doesn't really care. It works equally well both ways. Um, when all of this was happening, however, people said, well, wait a minute. Surely one of those is just a mathematical artifact. We didn't really think that we would be able to have energy and information flowing backwards in time. Nobody really paid attention to that. Instead, they just focused on what was considered to be the real solution, and that was entropy. Entropy is that scientific principle that says there is a particular order in which things evolve in time. And it does a good job of explaining, for example, why if you pour milk into your coffee, you cannot unpour the milk out of your coffee afterwards. It's basically the element of the laws of physics that describe causality, how the things in the past lead us to those things that are going to happen in the future in a causal sense. And it does a really good job. However, it's still only half the story. There are certain areas where it fails. The most notable of that is, in fact, life. Because as far as entropy is concerned, what should happen is we as complex humans should evolve into amoebas and simpler things. But of course, that's not what happens. Amoebas have evolved into us, and that's very not an entropic process, but it is a very syntropic process. In looking at the idea of syntropy, now the reason it didn't wasn't particularly popular when these ideas were first sort of being studied out of the equations was there's this sort of pesky -1 under a square root sign. As I don't know, that can't be real. Of course, nowadays we're finding that a lot of things that are very real result from imaginary numbers, and so that argument doesn't really hold true so much. And furthermore, people have been able to do experiments that show that in fact there is information that's flowing in the other direction in time and even energy. And this idea of causality, except for you perhaps wouldn't call it causality if the thing that is the cause is happening in the future. Rather, you might describe that as purpose. So it's a very nice symmetric idea of looking at entropy, which talks about causes for why we are today and why we may do the things we are tomorrow, as well as purpose, which is to say we do make the choices that we make, things happen because there is a future point that is our destination, and that influences us in the decisions that we make and how things will ultimately evolve to get to that future point. And this works very nicely, and we'll tie it in at the end to the idea of syntropy. But if you think about like what in your own life, there probably are cases where you've looked at yourself and said, you know, I don't know why I did that. I made a choice. I chose something that, as far as I could tell, really wasn't logical or sensible, and yet it felt at that moment like that had to be the right choice. I received some kind of information that inspired me or informed me, whether it was consciously understood or subconsciously appreciated. There was something that made me choose the left-hand road versus the right-hand road, or whatever it is. I know for myself, lots of examples throughout my life where I just simply can't explain certain things that happened, and yet they led to what turned out to be extremely important events or circumstances within my own life. We'll get back to a little bit of that. Let me go to sort of the experimental side of this. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, which started in the late 1970s, was looking at a variety of different things. One of which was the ability to receive information through non-traditional means. ESP, remote viewing, however you want to describe that. And that was a part of the program. And that already in and of itself kind of ties into this idea that there's information going forward and backward in time, because people were demonstrating the ability to precognitively receive information that wasn't going to be available until some future point. In fact, in many cases wasn't even didn't even exist as information until some future point. For example, one of the experiments that people researching syntropy did was to set up a computer that would have different squares on the screen. And behind one of those squares would be an image, and people were asked to guess behind which square would be the image. And they were then monitored, and they found that they would have different reaction at sort of a heart level when they picked the right square. There was more of a reaction than if they got it wrong. Further, that the reaction began prior to when the answer was revealed. In fact, the response began prior to when the computer decided behind which square the image would be. In other words, the information didn't even exist at the time that people would have that reaction. So it all happened within very just small fractions of a second. But still, there was something that was happening there that was working backward in time. The PEAR experiments on remote perception also demonstrated this. But perhaps more stronger case even than that were the other experiments that they did. Those experiments would have an operator who would sit in front of a machine and try to influence the outcome of that machine. These are the machines that Gina mentioned are up in Yorkshire at the Weird Experience that you can see. There were a variety of different ones. Some of them were purely mechanical. One huge one that sits on one of the walls there would dump 9,000 marbles down through a series of pegs, and a person sitting in front of it was asked to try to influence just through intention to make more balls bounce to the left or to the right. And indeed, they were able to do this. There were other phenomenon, things that were thermal, things that were optical, fluid mechanics, you name it, all of them. By far the most common experiment, because it was easiest to collect the data and fastest to run, we're using what were essentially electronic coin flippers, devices called random event generators that would produce a series of ones and zeros completely at random with 50-50 odds left to itself. And then people were asked, we want you to influence this. We want to have more ones than zeros or more zeros than ones. So people would do this. And the people who would do this were anybody. In fact, the one way that you would be excluded from the data set that they collected was if you came in and said, I'm really gifted. And then they said, okay, you can run it, but we're not going to include you in our data. We only want data from people who are sort of the normal people, if you could define such a thing, right? So it was students who came in, people who had heard about it, what have you, anybody would come in, and they collected this data and they found out that, yeah, this is something that everybody can do. Some people are stronger at it than others, not probably because of any biological or genetic thing. This is a little bit of an aside to where we're going to go in this particular talk, but it tended to be about state of mind. People who were more comfortable getting out of their intellectual heads and working through feelings tended to have a stronger effect. But it was an effect that everybody had in some way, and everybody had sort of their own characteristics of how they did this. Pardon me. Now, there was something that was really interesting. Once you start seeing these effects, all kinds of questions come up. For example, are there differences between the effects that men have versus women? It does seem that there are different characteristics of these. What about if you have a man and a woman working together? Well, that also is slightly different. What if these were a man and a woman who were sort of emotionally connected? Okay. What if it was a man and a man who were emotionally connected? What if it was a woman and a woman? Right? All these permutations all had some kind of influence on this. But perhaps most interesting and most directly related to what we're going to talk about here was, well, I'm sitting in front of the machine. Well, do I have to touch it? Well, no, you don't have to touch the machine. You're sitting in front of the machine. But if I'm sitting in front of the machine, then does it matter if I'm sitting this close to the machine? I'm sitting this close to the machine. What if I go in the other room? What if I go in another building? What if I go to another country? And so they did experiments with all of this, and what they discovered was it has nothing to do with it. You will have the same effect whether you're sitting in front of the machine, whether you're hugging the machine, or whether you are 5,000 miles away in a completely different location. And being further away does not decrease the strength of the effect. Far as any data showed, space has nothing to do with this. The connection between the operators, it was called, and the machine was the same, independent of how far away. It was not a spatial relationship. That naturally raises the question, okay, if space has nothing to do with it, what about time? So other experiments were run. Sometimes somebody would pardon me, would run the machine and try to have an influence, have that intention while the machine was running. That was certainly the most common. But then what if you ran the machine, but you had your intention a week earlier to have an influence on the way the machine ran? Or what if you ran the machine and then a week later, or a month later, or a year later, whatever it is, tried to have your influence on the machine? And not surprisingly, given the way I've been talking about it so far, it had no effect one way or the other. Or said differently, the effect, the ability for one's intention to influence the behavior of the machine worked no matter when in time you attempted to do it. So time was not a factor in any of this either. And the effects were just as strong if you were having your intention while the machine was running as if you had it before or after. Same thing. The only thing that did make a strong difference was if you believed that there's no possible way that this would happen, then you tended not to have any effect. One's own belief seems to be a limiting factor in this. If you tell yourself that it isn't possible to have, that your intentions can't have an effect, they tend not to have an effect. Although, interestingly enough, sometimes when you believe so strongly that you cannot have an effect, you actually have an effect in the sense of having so little effect that it is statistically unusual itself. Interesting side story for another time. So here we have experiments that are showing that we are able to have an effect on a system independent of time and space. Time and space do not seem to be relevant factors for this kind of thing. Now, what did make a difference was the degree to which the operator felt that they were connecting to the machine. So people who said, all right, I'm going to force the machine to do this, or I'm going to shoot my intentions, I'm going to make the machine do a thing, they didn't tend to have particularly good effects or strong effects. On the other hand, people who said, no, what I did was I just entered into a relationship with a machine. It wasn't a me doing it to it, it was an us doing it together, right? When you created that connection, that resonance, then all of a sudden, quote unquote, sort of, if I can use the term, that's when the magic happens. It's through the relationships, and that's a strong implication for the nature of interconnectedness between things. Now, we always, or not always, but typically when we think about interconnection, we think about interconnection between human to human, or maybe human to your cat, or to whatever it is. But in fact, for people who sort of practice interconnection and resonance and so forth on a day-to-day basis, we tend to recognize that there's the same kind of resonance, the same kind of relationship, whether it's between a human and a human, or say me and a tree, or even something that is traditionally not considered to be alive, like the desk that's here. You can establish these kinds of relationships and these resonances. In short, there's every reason to believe, based on the data that was collected, that we are in fact interconnected with all the things around us, and that it is our intention that allows us to sort of leverage that relationship for a particular purpose. Now, let me move on to sort of the last of those three examples. I mentioned the models that are sort of the physics way of thinking about it, the experiments that were used in PEAR that supported the same idea. But I also do want to talk about synchronicity. Most people have had something unusual that has happened to them that said, wow, what are the odds? So the sort of the almost canonical story of this is, I was thinking about somebody who I hadn't talked to in years, and all of a sudden they picked the phone rang and that was them. How strange that was. Or I was really upset, and as I walked past that light, the bulb blew. whatever it is, things that you say, wow, that's an interesting coincidence that these two things happen at the same time. But the more that one studies this and collects examples of this, there are so many cases that are beyond just saying, well, it's just one of those things. For example, if you read about moments of death for people, an unbelievable number of clocks stop at the moment of death. Okay, clocks will sometimes stop functioning, but there are a lot of clocks that stop functioning when people die. Far more than simple coincidence would suggest. This idea of synchronicity, that there are things that are happening that are meaningful coincidences, things that help guide us in our lives towards different directions. Now, how you draw a boundary around this tends to be up to the individual. For example, some things that feel like they're perfectly just sort of unmeaningful, it's hard to say at the time. For example, somebody in the grocery store does something really nice for you. That's unusual, but it does happen, right? You only have a few items. Why don't you go ahead of me? And it puts you in a good mood. But how do you decide where the consequences of that could end? I'm now in a better mood. The next experience that I have has been shaped by the fact that I'm in a good mood, which then continues to build and build and build. So even the most innocuous kinds of events in our lives often have the ability to create huge outcome differences. And these synchronicities, as you study these, and people have collected thousands upon thousands of reports of synchronicities, tend to have certain characteristics that are recurring about two people who find themselves having exactly the same experience at exactly the same time, or thinking about each other, or so forth. And in the context of what I was describing before, if we are indeed all interconnected, right, it's not in any way surprising that this would be the case, right? That interconnectedness would explain synchronicities. If we have two lives, for example, that are intertwined with each other, the course of those lives, it's only natural that they are going to influence each other in many ways without that conscious awareness, perhaps not even in a recognizable way until, say, 5, 20, 50 years in the future, you look back and say, huh, that was a defining moment, and I couldn't have explained why. I'll give you an example of this out of my own life. When I was in college, my primary goal was just to have fun. I was not trying to find a life partner. That was not, and I was well aware of that. It was not my goal. In fact, I never saw myself as getting married. I never saw myself as being a father. I never saw myself in any of that. It was just to do the things that I wanted to do. At one point, for no reason that I could possibly explain, I decided, I want to play a game. The next relationship I have, I'm just going to try to be honest and open in everything that I do. I don't know why. I don't know why I made that decision, because it wasn't really what I was interested in college. But it was like, well, it's an intellectual curiosity. I started dating someone, uh, and I was open and honest and everything. Now, looking back, you could say, what do you expect to happen when you're honest and open in all respects with your girlfriend, right? Well, you probably would build a really strong relationship, right? But why? Why did I choose that moment? And indeed, that is exactly what happened. That girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, the mother of my children, right, and so forth, and which led into this path. And I'm thinking, what are the odds that that moment in that time, right, that brought all these together, and then to have brought into being the various children. My eldest daughter, we had people who came around talking, and several weeks before she was conceived, out of the blue, would ask my wife, "Are you pregnant?" No. Why? Right? But many people had this sense of like, there's something different. There's something rare. And we had that same sense as well. Somebody hanging around. All of these pieces that came together, right? It's a very unusual kind of thing. A lot of synchronicity that appears. And it makes perfect sense when you view our lives as being the lives of interconnected people, or overall interconnected entities. Right? So Let me just sort of move on from there. I looked down and went, well, I've been talking a long time. Okay. Move on a little bit so we have some time at the end for questions, right? If this is the case, if indeed we are an interconnected whole, and if indeed time and space are not fundamental properties of an objective universe, but instead are tools that we use to explain our lives, to experience our lives, to be able to describe our lives, what does that imply, right? And I should mention, by the way, that there are other pieces of evidence for why time and space are not fundamental as well. If you're familiar, for example, with near-death experience stories, most people who have near-death experiences will say that in the experiences that they have, time is not inherent in that. It's only after the experience is over and they return to quote unquote normal reality that they start to put things into a time sequence based on what must have happened. If the accident must have happened before I went into the ambulance and went to the hospital and so forth. So it's the logic that's putting it in there. If there is no fundamental time and space, and you ask yourself, what is the I? What is me? Right? The logical answer is that it's the awareness of oneself. Right? It's that tiny little fraction of the totality that says, this is me. I'm going to acknowledge myself. I'm going to draw boundaries that define myself in context of everything else. The idea that we have a life, right, no longer becomes that we inherently start at one point and move along that life, but rather that we have the life because we've identified a particular piece of reality that is where my consciousness is going to focus itself. And when I focus it over here, I'm going to call that birth. And if I focus it over here, I'll say that I was 10 years old. If I focus it over here, I'll say that I was 50 years old. And over here, then that's when I died at whatever age that's going to be, right? The actions, the things that we do ultimately are the focus that we have, or said differently, the intentions that we have. Those are indeed the actions that we take at the most fundamental level, right? And when we take those actions, when we relate it to ourselves, that ties in based on the sensations that we have. When we create that connection between myself as an operator and the random event generator, right? We develop a shared experience of that. I have the experience right now sitting in front of this camera in order to be sitting in front of all of you to have a shared experience in its own way, right? All of these things become part of our experiences. And I think it's important to note that these experiences go far beyond what we would normally call sensations in the sense of five senses, right? We're taught from early age, well, we have five senses. We have sight and sound and smell and taste. But we also know that these are not clearly defined as, or at least as clearly defined as what we tell everybody that they are. Well, we know that taste and smell are not independent senses. In fact, if you've ever talked to somebody with synesthesia, you know that even sight and hearing, or sight and smell, or even sight and smell and concepts are not the same. People can tell you that certain numbers have certain flavors to them and so forth. There are different sensations that are there. And in fact, we have a lot more sensations than even that, right? Because one could look at this and say, well, how do I know the sensation of my own physical awareness of where my arms are? I don't need to have my eyes open to see, to have that sense, or a sense of hunger, or a sense of love, or any of the rest of these things are very much also senses in their own right. And in fact, it's probably much more likely that our idea of sensation is the same kind of storytelling that we were talking about with time and space. That is to say, I have a sensation and then I'll tell myself a story. I'll use a narrative to cast that as sight when it feels like sight is the most applicable for that. Right? If you ask somebody who's sensitive to other people's auras, they will tell you that maybe they see the aura. But if you probe into it, it's not usually sight in the purest sense. It's more of a sensation that is best mapped to sight, or it's easier to map to sight than, say, taste, but it's different for everybody. Right? So it's often the case that we have sensations, and I think these are an important part of how we interact with our environment, is ultimately as sensing beings. So it's natural also to ask, as we go through this, why is it that all of these ideas feel so weird? Right? Why is it, and when this is weird in the bad weird, in this WEIRD weird sense, right? Why is this weird to us? And I think the answer is because we're brought up explicitly to not think this way. It's not a sort of a, mwahaha kind of plan on people's, but it's simply the way that as we grow up and the way that language has formed and then continues to structure our own way of thinking about things, it makes it harder and harder to escape those chains of language that we use. They're convenient, but at the same time, they restrict us. As an example, I've worked quite hard over the last 5+ years to learn how to think outside of the boundaries of time. And yet it's extremely difficult to form a sentence that isn't grounded in the idea of time. We inherently put in this idea of past, present, and future in almost everything we do. It takes a lot of effort to escape that. So it's natural. We can ask, why is it that we have so much trouble? We can remember things in the past, but we don't typically remember or foresee things in the future. Well, it's quite possible that we used to do that a lot as very small children, as infants. We may very well have had access to all of those, but we're conditioned to only pay attention to the ones that are in the past. Because if you have an idea, you say, I'm having this experience right now, and your parents say, I don't see it. No, 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 no. And here's the the most awful phrase, just your imagination. And then the child goes, oh, that's just my imagination. So what they say is, that's not real. And so I don't pay as much attention to it. And then I don't pay attention to it. And now I'm not as sensitive to it. So I pay less attention to it. And ultimately, we become desensitized to it entirely. The ability to do any of this atrophies. But of course, within our world, there are lots of cases of people who are doing extraordinary things, quite possibly simply because they didn't allow that to atrophy out of the realm of possibility for them. I recently came across the story of a woman in Brazil who manifests physical objects out of cotton. To me, that is the most mind-blowing story. I can't believe that it's not a world-known phenomenon, because it's so far outside the realm of normal experience. And me as a conditioned physicist, I'm like, oh, no, wait. But if you listen to the story, and I won't go into it, it's, there's every reason to believe that this is a legitimate thing, but we don't do it as a rule because we're conditioned out of it. We're told that that's not a possible thing, so we don't allow ourselves into that range. So language, which is very powerful, right, is also very powerful in both directions. Powerful for communication, but also powerful for limiting the way that we're able to think about things. So this brings us back to the question where I started, right? Why would we do this? What would make somebody say, you know what, I want to have an experience in life where I don't know what is in the future. I maybe can't even remember everything in the past, or in fact, better said from my point, where we even accept the idea of future and past at all. Why would you go through this experience? And I think, first of all, we should recognize, or I believe, that it is a choice, right? We do this out of with volition, not necessarily in a volition that we can remember while we're in the moment. Just as if we're really absorbed in watching a movie, we may not really be cognizant of the reason at that instant why we went into the movie in the first place. We're there, we're enjoying it, we're absorbed and invested in it, right? And this is the key word in all of this. We are invested in it. If I had been in one of the breakout groups and said, would I be willing to have all the power in the world to do anything that I want? Would I be okay with knowing everything that there is to know? I would say no. And the reason is because I think that in doing so, we erase the idea of value. Value, I propose, comes about from investment. And that is to say, investment of ourselves. The things that are most important to us that we value are the things that we have invested in. And if one can do anything then nothing is particularly special above anything else. If we know everything, then there isn't anything in particular that is really exciting to know. In order to have the emotional experience of a life, one has to agree to certain rules that say, I'm not going to know what's going to happen in the future. I'm going to allow myself that uncertainty. And in doing so, I'm going to have the roller coaster that is life, the excitement of going, of the ups and the downs and so forth. And I think that's why we go through this whole process, to have these meaningful emotional experiences that we can't have until we've invested a part of ourselves in that by filtering out everything else. Okay, so just let me wrap this up with sort of what I think is sort of the last logical piece to this. And that sort of is the big question of, okay, so what? Now what? What do we do with all of this? If Jeff, all right, I believe you. You don't have to believe me. Believe whatever you want. You should only believe what you want. You don't have to believe Jeff because he's the guy talking at the moment, right? But let's say that you did believe me and you said, okay, fine. What happens now? I think the important thing about all of this is it gives us the motivation and sort of the foundation on which to start asking, how can we change the way we view ourselves? And I think the most important aspect of this is the one that I started, that we change the perspective of ourselves as being isolated individuals and recognize that we are very much not isolated individuals. We are sort of components, cells of a bigger life form. We're part of a much larger ecosystem. In the same way that the different cells in my body are all doing their own thing, but they're all working ultimately for the health of the greater good. And that's really where I believe we should be working as well, right? Towards that greater health, to ask ourselves, me as my individual cell that is Jeff, what can I be doing that helps create the greatest health for the overall system? And you can see, and I won't go into the questions of environmentalism and such, but obviously I do believe that we should be protecting the environment. Right, but this is something that becomes a very logical thing for us to do in our own sense. If you looked at two different bacteria in your stomach, and bacteria one said, I'm the most important bacteria and I'm going to kill all the other bacteria in the stomach. As the overall body, we would not be pleased with that, right? Nobody wants the left hand to say, the left hand is the only important part of the body, and I should be the one that determines, as the left hand, I should be the one that determines when the heart beats. No, it doesn't make any sense, right? Each of us plays a particular role in this. This idea that one person or one company or one country should be the one that determines everything is crazy, right? What would we call a cell in our body that insists that that cell is the most important cell, right? We'd call that cancer. That's what cancer is. That's the cell that says, I'm going to make more of me, more of me, more of me, more of me, until everything is me, not realizing that there is no point in having more of the same cell over and over. And in this, you recognize that the importance, the criticality of balance, right? Not balance to create a homogeneous system, right? But balance to recognize that everything in the system should be different. We want it to be different. The strength comes from the diversity of all the different elements that make up the overall system. We don't want to have everything be the same. We want everything to embrace the strengths of everything that is out there and find a way that it all works together. This, by the way, is sort of the underlying message in Nexus. So if you were wondering what ultimately that book was about and what its message was, it is that we should be looking for ways to work in a balanced environment to embrace as much entropy as syntropy. Syntropy is not better than entropy, and vice versa. It's only when they are working in a balanced complement to each other that you get the healthiest of environments. It is not that men are better than women or women are better than men. No, it's not that yin is better than yang or yang is better than yin. It's not that the past or the future is better than one another. It's that they are complements to each other and there's a role for each of them. And it's when we recognize that working together is where you get the balance, it's where you get the harmony, it's where you get the greatest health for the overall system. And the greatest health for the overall system will itself lead to the greatest health for each of the components. If you want to be as healthy as you possibly can, you want to live in a healthy environment. You want to be in healthy relationships. You want to be eating healthy food and all the rest of that. Right? So this is really a shift in our own thinking. And this shift goes back to the earliest of days when we're taught as children, that there's a right and a wrong, and that we want to be right. We don't want to be wrong. But wouldn't it be a lot healthier to look at this as saying, look, there are just different angles on the way to perceive things. Even in today's environment, if you say, well, I view the world the way everybody else views the world, therefore this is the right way to view the world. I probably don't, that's probably not really happening the way that you think it is, that there aren't all those people who are viewing the world the same way. There's a median, and that's fine. But instead of thinking in terms of right and wrong, if you thought, you know what, I'm close to the median, or I'm actually further outside, right? I'm outside my own experience. That thought is outside my own experience, realm of experience, my own box, if you will. That's it. Outside the box thinking. That's not what I expect. That's a much healthier way of looking at it. Instead of focusing on this right and wrong, which suggests a hierarchy, right? It's simply there's a spectrum of different ideas, a spectrum of different ways of being, and there's value in all of them. And I think when we think about the world in terms of interconnectedness, it naturally inclines us towards this healthier way of living. Okay, so that was really the essence of my presentation here. Just to leave you, I would say if you want to learn more about this, by far the absolute best thing that you can do is continue to think about it, right? To explore this idea, explore it within, contemplate it within yourself, look for the examples within yourself, look for it in the world around you. I think you will find that it is there. Make those connections with other people that will give you different ways of thinking about it. Spark you, maybe say something that just makes you think about something a little bit differently than you otherwise would. In terms of specific places that you can go, there are lots. It would take me forever to list them all, so let me just mention the ones that I'm most familiar with. Obviously, we've mentioned Nexus a number of times. I think it's a great book. I may be slightly biased, but I really do. Consider that. ICRL, my organization, ICRL.org, has resources to do this. We get people together to have, pardon me, to have discussions and so forth, and people are absolutely welcome to join. They're always free. We just want to do that. For example, every Saturday, in what would in the UK be in the afternoons, we have groups that get together. We're actually doing a cool thing right now, working with the Institute of Noetic Sciences to do sort of a pre and post test of sensitivity. That's kind of a cool experiment. We can learn more about that on the website. And go to gatherings like the Science and Consciousness conference that was mentioned at the beginning that happens up in at Broughton, which has to be one of the most beautiful places you will ever find on this planet. It's just absolutely amazing. Lots of other conferences that are going on that talk about this. I know for myself, I'm going to be going over to the UK. Pardon me, I swallowed around. Going over to the UK in September for the Euritas conference, so I'll be talking there and part of a panel talking about synchronicities if you want to get into that a little bit more. But you'll find that there are a lot of different conferences that are happening all throughout the year. And it's a great way to, to continue to dive into these sorts of things. So let me stop there. Give us a few minutes at least to answer questions or to engage in some dialogue after this. Thanks to all of you for your attention.
You have a glass of water. Have a sip of water.
Indeed, this is.
Well, we put on the chat. We put the link for ICRL, link for your book, and people can see the picture. And I've put on the Avalon Wellbeing upcoming
Wonderful,
retreat,
wonderful.
Science and Consciousness, November 2024, which going to again, and a wondrous gathering where all the things that are really weird become completely normal. Remote viewing from the forest.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, and that is the funniest thing, that these experiences that people say, well, that's strange, that's not real. Almost everybody has them. So they are the norm for most people. It's actually the rare person who's not had some experience like this in their life. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
it allows people to embrace their fullness,
Yeah.
and this is, I remember years ago going to the Wisdom 2.0 conference in San Francisco, where people from, this is before people did yoga in organizations, early 2010s or whatever, or 12. And people said that they came there and they could be their full self, in all of that consciousness conversation, and then take it back to their company. And as the years went on, their companies came. So these things ripple out, don't they? This is exactly what's happening with the summit. So anybody got a question? I'm looking in the chat. Okay. It's a long quote. Yeah.
And just imagine what this world would be like if everybody was comfortable just being who they were. Wouldn't that be nice?
It's a thought, isn't it?
Gina?
Somebody speaking.
Yeah, I just said, could I ask a quick question?
Go for
Jeff
it.
mentioned about giving an speaking outside boundaries of time, thinking and speaking outside the boundaries of time. I just wondered if you could give an example of that.
In terms of the kinds of things, like examples from my life, or
Yeah, just like where you
yeah.
said try and think outside of the boundaries of time. And
Yeah.
we're just not used to doing that. What would
Right.
be an example of that?
So I'll give you maybe two examples. One that is a very day-to-day kind of thing. I have historically been somebody who drives really quickly, and we'll just leave it at that. Right? I drive very fast, and I love driving fast. And for most of my life, if somebody pulled out in front of me, my natural reaction was, right? I did not want that. I wanted what I wanted. Right? Thinking outside of time in a simple case like that, to me, is taking that moment of stepping back and saying, I normally am thinking this purely in a cause and effect. I want to do this. This person has done that, and therefore I must do this. I cannot do that, whatever it is, very causal. But as I have practiced over the years and trying to think about things not in a causal relationship in that sense, I have found I'm more inclined to ask questions now that are something to the effect of, I wonder what in the future might be the result of this situation. And perhaps this is entirely about bringing me to a point in the future that I otherwise wouldn't reach, getting to my destination at the right time, as opposed to the fastest or earliest time, right? So in some cases, I hate to say trivial in that sense, but it's applied to individual little pieces of the day, just a little shift in my thinking that says, wait a minute, this is more about the overall picture, much more about the way that the universe functions as a dance, right? All the individual pieces that are working together, as opposed to just me in my own little bubble, looking at what does my life look like in this moment and what are the causes and the pushes for me, but saying I'm part of this overall dance. For example, I went to a book signing a couple of weeks ago at a local bookstore, and I ended up having a conversation with this young lady who came by, and I became convinced that the entire reason that I was there, and it was sort of my event because I was there signing books for myself, I'm quite convinced that the only reason I was there was to have this conversation with her, that this was entirely, in fact, about her. She was the reason that this book signing happened, because we needed to have that conversation, because she needed whatever that one thing was that she was going to discover out of that. It's a different way of looking at the world. It becomes much more of a dance. everything working in harmony with everything else. And then I said the other sort of on the other side, an example is when you imagine trying to explain to somebody, all right, got this device here and it's going to run. And then after it's finished and all the results are done, I'm going to try to influence it 3 weeks from now, right? How do you think about that? What is the nature of the way we're normally inclined to think about cause? Well, am I changing the numbers? It doesn't quite work like that. Changing the influence is there, but it's a completely different way of thinking about the relationship of ourselves in time, and that the idea of time as an organizational thing is what I'm putting into it as opposed to what it's enforcing upon me. So that, I don't know if that helps, but
Thank you.
so thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. I mean, just looking here, Tom just made a comment about do we have time to go into it? Do we really have free will? Is what he's asking.
Yeah, that I think, that's a fantastic question. And it's one that I do think about a lot. The picture that I have in my mind, and because I have to put it into something that I can visualize in order to try to explain it to myself and to other people, so I sort of think about this interconnected dance as sort of threads that are all woven together in a particular way. My life maybe follows one of those threads. That's the narrative of me. And if one says, I'm going to stay on that thread, then the answer is sort of, well, I may not have free will because I know, that thread ends where that thread ends, and that's the path I'm going to follow. However, we don't have to necessarily follow any one particular thread. It's quite possible that as we go along, we may decide my consciousness, that awareness and that focus may jump to a different thread, right? And it's that choice of which thread we focus on that now enables the free will that we have, right? There's a parallel to this in a multi-universe sort of model that is that's hypothesized in physics, and for this it's actually a really nice model for all of that we have the ability to jump to alternate ways that this goes, because that's where we choose to focus. That's the action of our intention.
It's interesting you talk about threads because oh, hang on, Diane wants to ask a question. Okay, go for it, Diane.
Thank you. It's not so much a question, it's more an answer to the free will. I had another thing to say, but in answer to the free will situation, what you're talking about, Jeff, the dance of life, if you like, we're free to dance if we join in the actual dance. But the only way we join in the dance is by letting go of this is our will and just like seeing what's going on and following some kind of extra sense that we do have more senses than the 5. And if we follow the sense of my instinct says turn left here or go over there or talk to that person, start being a bit braver and following whatever happens, whatever crosses our path. And then you start dancing with life. Synchronicities happen every single day for me. Yeah. Life is a whole course of synchronicities that are just wonderful, and it's kind of like life going on. But what I wrote down while you were talking, you said it becomes a dance. And I thought, the bravery to let go, please give us the bravery to let go of making decisions. Oh, this will be good for me. Oh, that's the right thing to do. Forget all that. Just follow your instinct. I mean, we don't even know our instinct. It gets turned off, as you said. We get told that don't use your imagination. No, that was nothing. And all these repressive things that we're taught as children. I would be interested to know how you are with your children.
As good as I can be, not as good as I wish I was, because
we do our best, don't we? We do our best. Yeah. I'll stop talking though.
No, that's great. And your point about the synchronicities is that's everywhere. Everybody that I know who starts to focus on synchronicities and really pay attention to it, begins to see that they're happening so much more frequently than
once you start playing the game, you stop thinking the
Right.
other stuff and you just live that other way. It's another way of living, and there's a lot of it happening. Something is happening on planet Earth. The conversation, the questions at the beginning that you asked, the three group that we had, the chat was just lovely. I wrote some really lovely things down because I think we all understood that we are part of a bigger picture. You know, we're all drops of water in the ocean of life, if you like. Those are my words. I shouldn't say those, but you know,
Indeed.
yeah, looking at how to change the planet and how to move, how to evolve the human race into something spectacular. We could be spectacular. We're not supposed to be going to work every day.
Right. And we should live with the joy of discovery instead of the shame of being wrong.
And look for joy and beauty and
Yeah.
focus on joy and beauty. Yes,
Exactly.
absolutely. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. There's no right or wrong. There's just love. Sort of thing.
Yeah, well, if you want to boil it down to one word, there it is.
Yeah,
It is
exactly.
love.
All we need is love. I've got to
It's
stop
an
talking.
inspiring way to weave towards the ending. I was just going to add about Elizabeth Gilbert shared when I saw her speak in Sydney about how she got this download of a story, and it was quite complex. And this guy, and he had a Brazilian business and all sorts of things. And anyway, she didn't write it, but she was. She had it parked, and then she met with a writer friend of hers who said, "I've got this brilliant idea for a story," and she outlined the exact same story. And it's the story had a life. It was looking for an author, and Elizabeth didn't answer the call, and it found another author. And it was so clear that it was that story. So, you know, those threads are there, aren't they? That's what I was going to
Yeah.
say.
I had a very profound experience several years ago, sitting in front of a waterfall in South Korea. And for an instant, the world just took a 90-degree turn. And instead of being filled with things, with stories about things, it was filled with stories. And the things were secondary. The things were where the threads of the stories came together. And it's a very different way, but also a very legitimate way of looking at the world, because the narrative really is the whole point of all of this. It's the story and the experience that is why we go through these lives, to have these experiences. All right, sorry.
Well, Jeff, thank you. I mean, I won't say I'm speechless, but I'm I feel very enriched. I feel full. I feel expanded. I think speaking for everybody here, but I think everybody's enjoyed it. But yeah, I made a lot of notes, and just the conversation now about everything is love. It is so beautiful to approach the world and deeply remember all the time our interconnection. We forget, but to have it as a morning remembrance, I'm connected to everything, is a beautiful way of looking at the world. And I love synchronicities, and my life is peppered with them. I'm sure we could be here all night with all sharing our stories.